We think of ourselves as individuals. We take it for granted. We take it for granted that I'm an autonomous being and I make decisions on my own, but that would be completely alien a way of thinking at other points in time to how we are today. And so there is this kind of breakthrough. And what I'm trying to say is that the really hard issue here is how do we find ways of finding collective value, collective truth, collective beauty again, that allow us therefore to act together at new kinds of scales and new more kind of capacities that could arise out of that.
Welcome to episode 22 of Humans on the Loop. I'm your host, Michael Garfield, and this week I speak with Rufus Pollock, former Mead Fellow in Economics at the University of Cambridge, entrepreneur, activist, author of Open Revolution and Wiser Societies, RSA Fellow, and co-founder of Life Itself, Open Knowledge Foundation, Daytopian, and Second Renaissance. Rufus is a key player in the so-called liminal web, an active mapper of the ecosystem of emerging change-making organizations who, along with his wife Sylvie Barber and an extensive network of brilliant allies, strives to promote the shifts in consciousness and culture that we need to safely navigate our age of accelerating technology with wiser, weller ways of living together. Together we get into the good, bad, and ugly of our nascent planetary culture, the tension between ecological consciousness and economic force, the demands placed on us to reclaim time-tested strategies for community and meaning in our brave new world, the intertwingling of religion and science, and why technological solutions alone are woefully inadequate, however necessary, as we face our crises of collective action. It's an earnest, soul-searching, thoughtful, and far-reaching, extra-long conversation, and I hope that you find as much value in it as we did. If you do, leave a comment and visit humansontheloop.com for 9 more years of other episodes. Special thanks to everyone else supporting this work. Special thanks to everyone supporting this work on Special thanks to everybody supporting this work on Substack and Patreon or with tax-deductible donations at every.org/humansontheloop. All founding members just got free access to all of the recordings and readings from my recent Weirdosphere course, How to Live in the Future, over 20 hours of deep dives into the philosophy of technology, evolution of culture and consciousness, metadisciplinary study of time, and the changing nature of selfhood in our emerging age of planetization. In other words, if you like this episode, you'll love that course. It's something of a preview and something of an expansion on my upcoming book at Integral Imprint with Jeremy Johnson. How to Live in the Future is an all-in exploration that changed. It's something of a preview and something of an expansion on my upcoming It's something of a preview and something of an expansion on my upcoming book at Jeremy Johnson's publisher, Integral Imprint, and an all-in exploration that challenged everyone involved in a good way. And it's yours too now, if you missed it. And since you're here for this kind of thing, let me just hang out a teaser for that book, my new essay at Aeon Magazine, Homo Crustaceus, by far the most work I've ever put into a commissioned essay. In it, I explore civilization's troubled relationship with language, technology, and the biosphere, laced with riffs on sci-fi, memes, military history, and the evolution of crabs. Their editorial board shorted out when I turned it in and later told me they think it's one of the best pieces they've ever published. Journey on over to the show notes for the link. And with that, thank you for listening and enjoy this extra long immersion with the singular and wonderful Rufus Pollock. So yeah, I was just looking last night over the document that you keep such a structured thing where I don't know many people that take notes themselves in random discovery meetings and then keep that document and update it with every meeting and invite the person as the collaborator and then go back, and you're actually doing a very, very active curation of the history of our conversations dating back to October when we first came together and talked about this. And so it's interesting to go back and look at.
Yes.
Oh, I was reading Robert Poynton's book back then. I was talking about Humans on the Loop as an inquiry into the decoupling / reconciliation of instrumental and intrinsic functions and values. And this, like, I was going through a dark night of the soul about how I had led people astray in my 20s by insisting that you couldn't have that you should have a job you love. And then now it's like back to that. Like I just gave a lecture to my friend's art class online where I spent a lot of time talking about AI and generally algorithmic concentration and displacement of talent. And I said to them basically, you'd better be doing this because you love it. Like that's making art for money and thinking of it as yours and trying to develop your style that you can then fence and market in some sort of competitive environment is actually making you more subject to displacement. And so there's that sort of bio a como la fe fugitivity thing going on of no, the point of the art is never to settle, to continue discovering. Anyway, hey,
Hey,
you're on the loop. How are you doing, man?
I'm great. Great to see you, Michael. It's good to be here. Yeah. And I like the segue.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that rambling we'll keep in there, but it is worth noting that there's this question that you and I both care about, which is the question of value
Mhm.
and the question of, what makes life good and how do we commit to goodness, whatever we may think that is. I liked your bit on religion, which we'll get to later, that you wrote with Sylvie about real community, deep intention, commitment, saving all of the good parts of religion from the trash without dogma or oppressive sclerotization. So, yeah, let's tell your story. I would like for you to go back really far into the misty recesses of your life and try to address yourself for us and explain why it is that you care about the things that you have committed yourself to and your ideas of good, and take as long as you like.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name's Rufus, Rufus Pollock, and I'm one of the co-founders of Life Itself, along with Sylvie Barbier, the performance artist, Liam Kavanagh, and others. And Life Itself is a collective that is dedicated to a radically wiser, weller world, and particularly seeding a second renaissance. And we sometimes joke that we're a Buddhist collective, although we're not all Buddhists, and we're not all kibbutzniks for those who are kibbutzes. So the thing is, we're really started in 2015, Life Itself, and I'm going to go back and like my story to that point, but we're now nearly a decade old. So personally, I grew up on a farm in England, and my mother was actually the farmer. My father was a lawyer. And from very early on, I had a lot of questions as a kid. And I also, I think, had a very strong sense of justice or unfairness and fairness. I don't know for other people, but going to school was not always a great experience for me. It wasn't terrible, but it was just like, it was never that interesting. It was not a lot of fun. And the other thing for me was just some kids were lovely, but there were also kids who just picked on others, bullied them, pushed them around, made fun of them. Not even me necessarily sometimes, but mainly other kids. But I was like, what? I just thought, I don't know if they came from my parents or where it was, but I can even remember being like 7, 8, 9, having this visceral sense, like how horrible this was. Really, I remember there was a kid with glasses very clearly, and he just, even at some point, like people like pulling his glass off and like, throwing them on the ground. And just, why do we do that? And what could we do? And I do remember there was one time there was a kid who bit me and bit another kid. And my parents said to me, listen, you've got to understand his parents are going through a divorce. I mean, I was like 6 or 7. I had no idea what that meant. All I know was like there was something bad or difficult happening for him and I should be understanding. And I think that this was a part from that point, very early, I had this sense of like, how would we have a fairer world? Even once I was a teenager, what would that mean? So I was really in inquiry about that. And there were two parts of that, I think. So one was that I was really wondering, like, why did we obey the school teachers at school? In fact, I decided I'd start doing experiments where I didn't obey the school teachers. And that went interestingly. And I stopped going to some classes. I started not going to class in some phase. And the other thing was I got quite interested at one point. I was reading books in the school library and I found this textbook on psychopharmacology. And I started reading about pharmacology, and you read about drugs and how they operate on the central nervous system. This is the mid-90s. So this is still like basically neurotransmitter time. This is before fMRI, like before the next wave. And I then got interested in psychedelics. So I was like, wow, there's these drugs they talk about that aren't addictive. They're nothing like alcohol or benzodiazepines. They're not, wow, and they sound really interesting. I should get hold of some. So that was the journey, which was this exploration of consciousness then began. Who was I? Who am I? Is there an I? And there's the connection of also like deep social change. How would we have a world where no one was bullied at school, where we just had an amazing, loving time? How would we have a world where we didn't I was seeing starvation sometimes on television, or a world where we didn't have these vast differences in money and wealth, which I was already aware of. And I noticed something I think I definitely got from my parents, which was we worked on a farm, and my parents' farm, but we had people who worked with us on the farm, and they were like family. And I remember very vividly my mother saying to me something quite young. She's, it doesn't matter who's someone. It doesn't matter if they're the king or they're homeless. They're equally worthy of respect. There's no difference in human quality. And that was quite different. I went to a school that was, I was a day part, but I went to a school that was like a private school in England where many of the people, it cost like, I was at the day part, but at the boarding part was like $30,000 a year to go. And so there were people with a lot of wealth and privilege. I as well, I came from a privileged background, but it was very clear for my parents, you never thought you were better than someone because of money or something like that, that we were all, even if we weren't religious, all equal in the eyes of God. And so that was really a strong influence on me. And the other part was I was really lost. The other part of my story was that I feel I really got viscerally the experience of the end of modernity and nihilism. So I don't know if people have read Bret Easton Ellis or not, but the depictions that Ellis was having, particularly like in Less Than Zero, were like quite close to experiences I was seeing at school. I remember a friend of mine once just in his garden, like just picking a rose, just ripping it apart. I was like, why are you destroying this thing of beauty? And he was just like, because I can. Why not? Why is it better to have a whole rose than not to have a whole rose? And I had no answer. And I really was confronted at this point by a very strong sense of nihilism. Like rationally, I was like, I don't believe in God. I don't have any spiritual practice. We're just atoms bumping into other atoms. There's no meaning. There's no purpose. And we're all alone. And that was very strong for me. And then kind of out of this, as I went towards university, I really got interested in Buddhism. I had this aspect about the consumerism of enlightenment from psychedelics, that there was this very powerful experience, but I couldn't really take it with me. I didn't have anyone else also to talk to. I couldn't talk to my parents about it really. And most of my friends were not they found it too much, or they didn't like it. It wasn't a pleasant experience. So I felt quite lost, and I started meditating and other things. But the journey I was on I was very lost. I didn't know really what path to go on. And I ended up really just working on, I guess, what I would call systems change around ownership of the information age, like I wrote the first definition of open data. I did a lot of work in open data and open knowledge and trying to basically change who owns the information age more. And I would say mostly less successfully. And then that was like what led me was this incredible convergence in 2015, where I met Sylvie, who's actually also my partner, and we founded Life Itself initially around this vision about wisdom. What was it actually to be wise? Like concretely, particularly there was this kind of aspect like, wow, we are really well off in the context of human history and even in the world today, living in England or France or US. Wow, we are immensely privileged. We don't want for food or shelter, and yet we're not that happy. And also, we can see really major crises developing in our society. So the climate crisis, even then, I was technology regulation and issues I was very aware of. And I've been an economist. I was an academic economist at the University of Cambridge for several years, working on information, but also basically public goods problems, commons. And I was very aware of collective action issues. So I was like, okay, we want to get radically wiser personally and collectively. And that was like life itself's beginning. And this focus ultimately on now like a second renaissance and the meta crisis.
All right. Just for the sake of my enjoyment, there are two books that I want to reference throughout this conversation in addition to your writing. One, as I mentioned, is William Irwin Thompson's Imaginary Landscape. The other is Federico Campagna's Prophetic Culture, which I'm skimming through now a second time in prep for this. And like both of them are looking at this thing. You talk about the dark night of the soul of nihilism. And I love this image, this encounter that you had with another kid. This, why is it better to have a whole rose? So there's a couple pieces here. And just as a way of delineating, how I'm going to handle my end of this, there's like an alchemical thing here of pulling apart and putting back together that I want to do with you as a way of directing attention to how we are all collectively doing that right now. And then
Yes.
where your thinking and Sylvie's thinking and everyone else in that community comes together. Okay, first, from Prophetic Culture, Campagna is talking about Middle Ages. He says, these traumatic moments of passage between worlds and times occur as often in the life of an individual as in that of a collective. When the closure of a world refers to the collapse of an entire civilization, historiography tends to define the following period as a Middle Age, a scenario where life proceeds in the absence of a voice capable of narrating a stable world. A long winter when the material of history is in part congealed and in part slowly rots away. This is, of course, how these periods are seen and judged from the perspective of a more stable world, but such partiality is revealing of the difference between worlds with unequal narrative rootedness. That our histories are presentist projections of a different mode of worlding. And so, going back to, I just saw, to date this conversation, I just saw Jon Stewart play with this in his riff on Trump and the tariffs, where he said, we're going from a simple caterpillar to a dead caterpillar. When he knows that this analogy has mainstreamed of like the idea that the caterpillar is dissolved in metamorphosis and reconstituted through the development of its imaginal cells into a butterfly. And of course, that's not at all obvious to the caterpillar. And then the caterpillar and the butterfly represent these two historical regimes. And we're in that gross, like soupy moment.
Yes.
And then, of course, then there's this other question about the rose. It's like, well, it depends. This, like, when a rose falls apart, when it scatters its pollen, there are all of these ways in which not a whole rose is actually part of a larger unity. And so then this is where I want to bring in Bill Thompson, whose Imaginary Landscape is in some part about the intellectual history of the Gaia hypothesis and autopoiesis and chaos theory and the emergence of a planetary mythos. And so he says in a footnote, 25 years after trying to construct a philosophy of worldview, I find myself coming around again to considering the nature of the human mentality and its changes through time. Now, of course, I would no longer believe in one single theory that could transform the complexity of a planetary ecology into a single linear projection. Now a theory would be more of interest as one narrative among many, one novel among a library of others, for it is the act of constructing an imaginary landscape of history that is exciting, just as once before it was the intellectual thrill of constructing a theory that was exciting. If the theory is wrong, then what does it mean? All theories of history are wrong, but as exercises in intellectual mythology, they become cultural performances. Small wonder that political cultures and academic subcultures have grown up around them and taken their stories to become history. So it's like where I think you and I are dancing around in the same field is in the question of how to engage in an appropriate allocation of mourning because we are so deeply inside of this thing that is taking, in some ways, a very long time to unfold. Thompson wrote this book in the 80s. And the fact that, like, some amount of grief, like you say in the Second Renaissance white paper,
Yes.
talking about the darkness before the dawn, and that we don't mean to trivialize the threats that humanity currently faces. It's vital to acknowledge the darkness and fear
Yes.
that arise in response to societal decline, but not to just give that
Yes.
all of its narrative weight. That it's not just like another story is coming. It's like many stories are coming.
Yes.
And how are they related ecologically, and how do we support that? And maybe there's a reason sometimes to pick apart the rose. Like Josh DiCalio, he's like, well, if all criticism is a hammer, well, you still need a hammer to build a house. So anyway, that's a rant, but that's where I'd like to start with you.
Yeah. So one was you could just trace this thread for me of how did I reconstruct truth and value. So in the kind of acid of reason, and particularly kind of reductionist reason, the good and the beautiful dissolve away, and we're left just with a sort of a kind of truth. And so part of my personal journey, but I'd also say what we're trying to do involve ourselves. So how do you, and it's there an integral and other things very much, how do we reconstruct those things in a skillful way without just going back? And you have valueception. How do we perceive the good? Now, one thing I just want to say at the beginning, I think crucial, is to say there's a mountain with no top. We might know up, but we don't mean we have the top. It doesn't mean we have the answer, but we can have better and worse answers. And so that was a huge kind of recovery. There was a personal aspect for me where I always had this kind of faith somehow that I could feel that was good. You knew that when you saw a kid bullied, it was that good, and that when they were held and cared for, that was better somehow. That what the first is not good in some way. But the more important question was how to do it with others, because you could have your own perception, but otherwise we'd say, oh, everyone's got their own subjective perception. So one is just like this journey. And I think wisdom is what I would term wisdom is deeply related to that. It's a capacity to perceive and act on skillfully the good and the beautiful. So this was one aspect of it, which is like, how do we know that? And then how does that spread in a group? So I think one thing there, this is this aspect that's a little bit subtle, which is there are definitely multiple, like, it's not like there's one truth right now and we all know it. No, there's multiple futures that could emerge. There's multiple futures that may emerge. And there are certainly many paths to those futures. And there's a reason, just pragmatically, why, for example, you end up having cultural homogeneity occurring within societies, or language homogeneity. There are less and less languages, and there are many tragic things about that. And there's a reason, which is as more people interact, you converge on a fewer number of languages to do that. And similarly, why, for example, it's reasonable to talk about modernity, and that we live largely in the cultural paradigm of modernity with all of the varieties of that, because modern belief systems, despite huge variation, but there's kind of core underpinnings, are very pervasive. They're in communist systems, they're in capitalist systems, they're in other systems. They're really all over the place there, if you like. And so I think this is also to ask about the future is there's one option where we might break up as a world economically and socially into smaller parts and then have separate areas and people can evolve separately. But if there is a lot of interconnection and coordination, there's reasons why you end up having some degree of alignment on like core views and values, because otherwise it's pretty difficult to interact. And we could go off on this point, but the thing that I think I really want to say is that how did we recover as lived experience, but in a way that was still amenable to reason and to exchange, not just like me dominating you and saying, this is what's good, this is what's true and beautiful, you do that. How do we recover coherence, but for this deeper level? Because to finish, one of the things that's happened in modernity is there are still some universal agreements, but they're very thin. The way I think of it sometimes is that a metaphor of if we were on Mars and there's no atmosphere, so we built our membrane over our city for our atmosphere. Now, if that membrane is very thin, the amount of air density might be very low and we don't have very much energy. We'll all be like, I feel very lethargic. And if the membrane is very thick and dense, then there's a lot of air, like the density of air can be high and we have a lot of energy. And this is true of like cultural membranes. If we have very thin membranes, we're like, what we agree on is everyone's right to do whatever they want. And what we agree on is some basic liberal agreement about negative liberty and maybe a bit of secularism. No one's going to impose a religion on anyone else. It's a very thin membrane to get much stuff done. I mean, it's good. There's a lot to admire about it. And one of the thorny issues to confront is how do you have stronger coherence, but without dominating people, without the way oppressing people. But I think this is one of the things that is so fascinating at the moment, that we're trying to have breakthroughs, like more broadly, I don't mean like you or I, but just generally, is how can we move to these new levels where there's still autonomy, but there's a collective again in a different kind. And no one has the answer to that question right now. But I think it's a level of breakthrough as we imagine what the development of like individuation, as Jung and others talk about it, was. The degree of difference is hard for us to imagine. If we think of ourselves as individuals, we take it for granted. We take it for granted that I'm an autonomous being and I make decisions on my own, but that would be completely alien a way of thinking at other points in time to where we are today. And so there is this kind of breakthrough. And what I'm trying to say is that the really hard issue here is how do we find ways of finding collective value, collective truth, collective beauty again, that allow us therefore to act together at new kinds of scales and new numerous kind of capacities that could arise out of that.
Okay, so there's two things there, and we're going to have to take them in some order. We'll loop back to whichever one seems worth punting.
Wait,
But one,
can I say one
Yeah.
thing, just what I should add, just we call it life itself, the way it's like we're sharing is this term second renaissance as a way of describing the desire for this paradigmatic shift at the personal and collective level, but acknowledging this breakdown. What I wanted to kind of add, because you said it's we are in a moment of mourning. One of the projects we did actually earlier on at Life Itself was called Requiem for Modernity. Like we have this kind of gravestone image and like writing poems. If you don't really have a funeral and if you don't really send off the past, you're always haunted by it. Particularly Sylvie, my collaborator, is beautiful. Like we're haunted by the ghosts of the past if we don't set them to rest. And a lot of the time, what we can see in myself, and I see sometimes in others, when we try to dream of futures, we're either like the angry teenager, like, I'm doing nothing like you, Dad. I'm going to do everything differently. You trash the planet. We're going to love all of the environment, whatever it is. Or we're sort of not even realize we're being our parents again in some way. We're just going to amp it up on the technology and we're just going to transcend into AI. We're going to go full on into the kind of techno-modernist vision. And so without us healing our ancestors and without acknowledging both what was difficult in our parents and what was great in them and like completing that, it's very difficult to create anything newly in a clean way. And so that's one thing. So that requiem you were talking about, and the second Renaissance term that we use, and this kind of vision and the project there is like, there is a death and there is a rebirth. In everything, to have a birth, there is always some kind of death. But it's the question of how do we renew? What is the rebirth here? The rebirth. And in particular, the other part I like about it, I want to emphasize is the aspect that we're both going forward, but also recovering things that maybe have been neglected or lost. So just in the first Renaissance in the West, there was this recovery of kind of the classical traditions, Plato, Aristotle, all of these things, wisdom traditions of a kind. So in this one, maybe at a global level, at least in the West, there's a recovery of wisdom traditions that have lost, and maybe there's a kind of cross-pollination that's never happened before.
Yeah, so to speak to the Eros and Thanatos piece of this, right? And Bill's framework for this, he says we're moving out of what he identified as a fourth cultural mode, this industrialization. And with each of these, the movement from culture made of bands, society made of tribes, civilizations made of city empires, industrialization made of nations, and the one we're moving into, which he believes is planetization made of the biosphere, each of them has a principal concern. And each of them, he says, we slay with technology and save the victim with art. So this process that you're talking about starts with humans becoming apex predators and early religions and artwork being focused on the animal. He references McLuhan as the sloughed off environment becomes a work of art in the new and invisible environment. This becomes something that we are operating on and that we no longer assume as the invisible subject, but it's not the water we're swimming in anymore. It's something that we are sacralizing. And so he says in industrialization, the victim was religion, the complex was art and science, the technology, print, and mechanization. In planetization, the victim is the mind, the complex was music, and the technology was electronics. And so I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of what Doug Rushkoff calls narrative collapse and the mental health crisis, but also this profusion of psychotechnologies that have been made more accessible than ever. You call them what you will, but that's a common term.
Yes.
Esoteric practices, as well as the other day, I just saw, of course, people are launching ventures where they're using AI to create precision psychedelic therapies, and the intersection of disciplines afforded by electronic communication brought the monks and the neuroscientists together and afforded the discipline of neurotheology. I had Alex Shakar on the show years ago, and he had written this gorgeous book called Luminarium, which was about all of this. It was about this sort of bright, dark coincidence of militarized virtual realities and transcranial magnetic stimulation induced Satori. But the human mind is, I think, as a through line through all of this, is the victim of digital planetary culture. But it also becomes this domain, which is like the domain in which this renaissance is happening. It's the domain into which we have new insight and have all of these fabulous new artistic instruments. I think like most people, when they like, of course, because we've been living through the last century has been deeply paranoid, and people look at like MK Ultra. They look at these like brainwashing. But there's this question again to go all the way back to the refiguration of our relationship to the animal at the very beginning of what it means to be, more broadly speaking, a modern human. And it's before we could, slay animals and then paint them on cave walls and wear their skins and develop that whole thing. There was also like, we had no capacity to develop the kind of relationships with them that we now have, some of us anyway, with our pets. Like we like our own understanding of animal intelligence just gets deeper and deeper. Our own appreciation of their inner life ways becomes more and more profound at the same time that our ability to investigate and quantify and specify all of that. And so there's this thing about the risk of getting lost in the abstractions and like Westworld, right? If the human being is an art object, then that means things that people aren't going to like. It means, to the modern industrial mentality, something really horrific or disgusting, like the Borg. Everyone's worried about becoming the Borg. But then you've got books like Arthur C. Clarke and Stephen Baxter's Light of Other Days, where we figure out how to send information through quantum tunnels. And so the kids that grow up in that world are all, the next Buddha will be a Sangha. They're this sort of brain linked, like Maitreya planetary Christ. And they all know that everyone can see everyone else all the time and that the future can see them through the quantum tunnels. And so the kids just stop wearing clothes because they're no longer ashamed of their nakedness. Like this horrific state of total surveillance is also the medium through which this other thing emerges. And so just to go back to like standards, and I guess where I want to take this is, you're right about the thin membrane of agreement. But like I think about wood, like living wood on a tree is very thin. The atmosphere on our planet is very thin. The neocortex, like these things that were like, where the conscious activity is, where the growing edge is, stands on what is actually an enormous consensus. And we don't see it because we're already living on top of this mound of abstractions. And so part of that work seems to be in recognizing, one, like how much we have in common that we're not consciously attending to, the core of the tree through which all of the water actually flows. And two, to understand that like the formation of standards, like this process of canalization and homogeneity, can be and often is the platform for incredible diversity. People like talking about the Cambrian explosion now. It's like hip. And it's like there was more disparity between body plans 540 million years ago, but there were fewer kinds of organisms. Somehow, the few phyla that made it out of that period became the basis for all of this other stuff. So anyway, I'm just playing around with that. And I'll leave it there.
Leave it there for a minute. There are a few things, there are a couple I will come back to. I think the thing to start with is to say, wow, where we are is pretty serious. And I think the simplest way to look, we're quite a serious situation. Things are not going great. We look at the existential risk, we look at ecological crisis, and that doesn't seem to be a widespread thing, or it's too terrifying that it gets repressed. And it takes something for us to look at that. And then what I think the other part of the story, which you're also alluding to, and I want to come back to, is there's hope. There are ways that we transform. And even sometimes they're related. In the dark, what we call the dark Renaissance version, the second Renaissance is kind of, oh, wow, this is breakdown, but this is rebirth. In the dark Renaissance, there's a dark age, which is what happened in the last Renaissance, even before the 14th century, let alone the breakdown after the Roman Empire. But in the 14th century, half the European population dies out of the plague and a famine. And that can be a catalyst, just as individually, when we have, sadly, often we grow the most as people when we have some significant challenge. Maybe it's a bereavement. Maybe it's losing our job. Maybe it's a partner going out of our life. These are often catalysts to our growth. They can also be just be a catalyst for breakdown, but they can also be a catalyst for growth. And there are many opportunities at the moment. I think the two that we'd refer to for the kind of move to a planetary civilization one is just the fact we're having this the technology that allows us to interact at a planetary scale, the ability to, I think even more deeply, things like working from home, like radical ways to reorganize production and our social organization. For basically several hundred years, we've been urbanized. We have to move together in order to work together. And that puts a whole bunch of constraints on. We can organize very differently. And the other, which is perhaps even deeper, is this convergence of ancient wisdom traditions and modern science and technology, which enables at least new levels of insight, maybe the making available of that insight to many more people. But that said, the basic concern that sits in the background is the massive wisdom gap. The massive gap between the powers that we've unleashed through modernity in its success, its technological and scientific success, that we can kill all of ourselves on the planet, that we can poison the whole ocean, that we can create maybe one day nanobots that will accidentally wipe us all out, that we can build AIs. And the speed of that compared to our cognitive and social capacities and I would say, I don't want to say cognitive, our ontological capacities, our awareness, our lack of reactivity, not just our cognitive complexity, all of these dimensions, our ability to hold that personally and collectively is massively out of balance with that. And the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which Marx used, this comes from Goethe, it is really, I think, the fairy tale of today, that we have loose powers beyond our control. And like the first thing would be to slow down. The first thing would be like, whoa, we don't really need to go faster. And which is a collective action problem we can come to. And the other point is that the electronic point also I'd say is we've had a lot of the insights in Buddhism, in other traditions for a long time about having humility and about how to develop to as it were, clean the mirror of insight and to see what are wise actions, what are truly skillful actions. And we don't do it. So it's like, oh man, I've now got this headset I can put on and do my neurofeedback and it's all going to like, oh, we'll all just wake up. And I'm like, whoa, we could have done that before and we didn't. And there's many ways you can abuse that. I don't know if people, I'll make a comment here. I have a lot of time for Jamie Wheel, and I never quite know. I've read Stealing Fire, and I don't quite know what way he means the book, because the first story is about Alcibiades abusing the mysteries,
Uh-huh.
taking these mysteries and abusing them in an infantile way. And the book then starts with the Navy SEALs, basically using mindfulness or group dynamics to better hunt down militants. Now, maybe you support the Navy SEALs, but it's a kind of bizarre use of psychotechnologies. And so I really think the first thing is the slowing down. Now, this comes to a collective action problem. I will talk to that, but I just want to say that we really in a moment where, when you really sit with those, like, oh, we are mad. We are acting in an insane way. I would not hand my 5-year-old a Kalashnikov and then say, play with your 4-month-old sister, and think he would go. And yeah, it's going to, let's just hand out the Kalashnikovs. So let's throw in a few bazookas for fight, give them to ourselves as kind of toddlers, and then run around and see who's lost a limb at the end. And I think the thing that I also want to break through, and this is why I'm on this podcast, is that we can do it. We live in an era, I like to joke, made by the American Enterprise Institute, but we didn't realize. The greatest skill the devil ever had was to persuade you didn't exist. We live in an era of immense cynicism and despair about our capacities to act together. Now, it's not easy, and we have. And some of that's not accidental. I want to end with that one I do, which is I start out like civic tech and open data and open knowledge. And the fascinating thing was I lived in places where people were doing tech for good. In a way, the tech industry and the tech area is the kind of like leading edge. It is the sociologically dominant, monetarily, ideologically of our era. When I used to meet politicians, they were like, wow, how would be like a startup or more entrepreneurial? And the point that I had was living around civic tech people, even learning what into politics. But the solution was always something like blockchain or a voting app. It was never joining a political party. And I used to say, Joe, I said, but don't you realize you're living in an ideology of the right? That the only thing we can do is through individual action and the market. And that the whole thing the market doesn't solve is collective action problems, externalities, public goods. And, the funniest thing for me was I was an economist at Cambridge. The older professors had all been economists, had become like young people in their 70s. They were all being Marxists. They were all joining parties. None of them were that now. And so I just want to say is that we live, and that these things can change. This is one of the biggest ideologies we live in without seeing, which is that we cannot act together, that we are corrupt in a way. It's a very old Christian. We are self-interested, rational beings, blah, blah, blah. Now, of course, there's truth to that. There's greed and ignorance and delusion and all these things in us. And we can transcend those things. And we have frequently in our lives, just even with our own children, let alone what we do for others.
Yeah. So for fellow Ken Wilber nerds or ex-nerds, I think you and I are playing a game in our conversations where the roles might flip if we were in conversations with other people, but we've settled into something where you're someone who worked in software and economics, but you stand in what Ken called the left quadrants of phenomenology and culture and the inner world. And I'm somebody who, for whatever reason, is a poet and an artist and tends to talk in and emphasize the systems we're embedded in, the right hand of that
Yes.
model. And so like just becoming like construct aware of this dynamic and knowing that you and I can like musical chairs and suddenly probably take each other's positions, and that would be really fun. Okay, so there's a couple things here. First of all, I want to make explicit the piece that you wrote on 4 types of problem, because you're speaking
Yes.
directly to this. Problems of science and technology, problems of preference or self-knowledge, problems of will or self-control, and problems of collective action, right?
Yes.
And the point that you make, as you say, I would argue that progress on the last 3 really comes from the transformation of being, and that we do have answers here. They aren't easy to follow. They are based on the ontology and practices found in traditions like Buddhism, which you said, and they require will and are not simply replicable, because just because I get enlightened doesn't mean you do, but if I invent a better way to grow corn, you can copy it easily. You finish that thought with, unfortunately for us, science tech solutions seem to help little with the other 3 items, and as we get richer, the value of science tech solutions are less and less important. So just because I'm feeling mischievous, the weird thing is that like I know so many people, and on the one hand, I'm a child of divorce. I see the thesis and I see the antithesis, and I don't know where I really stand on this, but I think it's interesting that, we wouldn't have Buddhism without books, and that there's swift growth in this domain of Jnanatech, right? This idea that as we get more fluent in this stuff, that we may actually be able to pass over the air updates. I used to talk about it in 2013 as being able to tweet each other orgasms and how annoying that would actually be. But again, like Bill Thompson talks about how planetization is defined by this sort of gradient, as he puts it, between noise and rapture mediated by participation. And that this is a society in which representation of identity is less important because identity becomes more fluid in the chaotic attractor basin of a planetary culture. And so we're always working this gradient between rapture and noise. And to your point about the dark renaissance, he says something that I found really pertinent about the way that, again, the adult developmental psychology upon which Ken's work is standing, work like Bob Keegan and Suzanne Cook-Greuter at Harvard talks about the maturation of adult egos in the fifth structure of consciousness, where you're no longer purely deriving values through an analytical examination of different cultures and authoring them, but you're recognizing that whoever is doing the authoring is defined relationally in process with that which you, the modern self, believe yourself not to be. Thompson says, what does the world look like when one looks out through the inactive embodiment of this new culture of nature? First of all, karma becomes seen as the generation of unconscious polities in which we do not take responsibility for our own affirmations through negation. We become what we hate, and we generate shadow economies, such as the drug economy in the United States, that are caricatures of the conscious economy. We cannot naively work to eliminate a General Noriega of Panama if we cannot see how a Latin American strongman is a cultural hero who is taking revenge for the development, quote unquote, of the third world by the banks of the United States. For our exports to them are as polluting as their exports to us, but their exports are a much more honest and less hypocritical expression of the damage to cultures and ecologies. This is going on right now in my country, right? Like that there's this shadow dynamic between the United States and other countries. And, it's funny because Paul Levy said something very similar back when George W. Bush was elected about how Bush's rise to power was symptomatic of a process of collective shadow projection, and that the hate of the other or the fear of the other was as responsible for his ascension as the people who genuinely believed in his virtue. That this regime comes out of this clash between selves that, in Levy's sense, like, I have no doubt that George W. Bush actually believes himself to be a good man and therefore projects evil out into the Osama bin Ladens, et cetera. But that a huge constituency of the United States is doing the same with him, and that there's this failure to recognize the interdependent co-arising of things. And I bring this up because I think that all of that just goes back to the four types of problem, right? And how these four types are related. And the idea that, like you had said a moment ago, that collective action problems are contingent on self-knowledge and on preference. And self-knowledge is to some extent contingent on will. And like, I just look at those four problems and I don't see them as separate. I see them as profoundly interwoven, where it's like, I wouldn't have access to a lot of the insight that I do. I have incentives for and against pursuing a transformation of being, thanks to science and technology. None of these things are unalloyed goods or evils. And again, it's like the stuff is all swirling around.
Yeah, they work together. Let's start with Sophie. So one is the motivation for myself is, let's say we want credible hope. We want to first, we like look at the situation we're in personally. Like, how could I be really well and joyful and flourish? If I had a Lamborghini and I had this, would I be? No. But also we look more significantly at the challenges, the confronting situation our world seems to be coming to, where in terms of, as I said, the climate crisis, the way technology advances, the existential risk from AI and so on. And then we want to say, what's paths of credible hope? And even before I saw those crises, when I was a teenager, I'd be like, I can't really believe in social anymore, but I want to believe in something more than just what I call like iPhone capitalism. Like next year, you'll get a little bit bigger screen. Wow. Is that really the best that we're just going to, I've got unlimited wants and limited resources. We'll just get a little bit better year by year. No, whether it's, you look at Buddhism, you're like, my God, Buddha's telling me I can have full on liberation. Like I can be profoundly free and content and joyful and contributing to the world. Or just, you want to look at more political stories. Like, hey, people could form different societies. There's something is off where someone has $100 billion and some people don't have enough to eat. That this can't be a healthy world. And I'm a big fan of Ursula Le Guin. You're seeing this and that, but just say, so one of the things I'm trying to do is say, okay, what I was asking myself is, what is a credible path to, let's say, addressing wicked problems and the meta crisis? And I wasn't convinced by communism and socialism. And this is where this typology of solutions come in that's useful and relates to 4 types of problem. And we want to walk through it, which is say, okay, let's pick a concrete one rather than abstract. Okay, the climate crisis. So one way is say, we're going to invent solar. We're going to we'll read Bill Gates' book. We're just going to have batteries and solar and breakthrough in fusion, and the technology will cut it. Markets will produce technology and it will be okay. Then this is if we're into our world, but this is top right, individual outer roughly, although technology always merges between the things. And then we might have system stuff like, wow, what we need better international governance systems, or we need carbon pricing, which is an international governance system, or we need, as XR wanted in England, Extinction Rebellion, third demand was we want citizens' assemblies. We will have a new kind of governance. And then there's what I would say is there's the left, what I call ontological solutionism. So the first one I said is technological solutionism. Then we had structural or systems solutionism. And then I would call ontological solutionism, which is a mix of the inner personal, like contemplative work. And then there's more, I would say, the cultural dimension, which actually is more relevant. I'm not just like, let's go sit on our cushions. And no, it's like change in views and values. And so the 4 types of problem refers to this, which is that we are in a world at the end of modernity that is almost always going to science and like techno solutionism. We will fix this from technology. And it turns out that collective action problems aren't that amenable to that, unless they can get you out of it in the sense they can get the collective action problem to go away. You're like, we will invent so much efficiency. And by the way, there's even an irony there, which is the way that we're funding the development of most innovation in solar at the kind of base level is through our massive success at solving a collective action problem, which is the public funding of science. Most basic research that underpins transistors, silicon, solar panels, the basic science, the core science was government funded to a significant extent. Even take Tesla. Tesla would not exist without massive government handouts and subsidies, right? Which are public goods in action. But just to say, when we look at a collective action problem, that how amenable is it to science technology? Now, I don't say, and I come back to it can support in various ways. And again, it's useful to think of a concrete analogy. We're all in our kitchen at our shared flat. There's 5 of us living together, Michael, me, 3 others. And no one's doing the washing up. The washing up, the classic thing, someone's leaving it in the sink. Now, we can use technology. I can start installing cameras. I can use the cameras to monitor who's doing the washing up and so on. But in terms of actually forming agreements, that's going to require governance and it's going to require the culture. And the real thesis that I'm saying out after that we came to is to say, of course we need technology. Of course we'll need governance. But the ability to enact those in the way that we need fundamentally depends on the being, on the culture. The way in the past, if we look at human history, that we've had breakthroughs to new scales of ability to address collective actions is almost always cultural or ontologically led, like inner led. Now that then manifests in technology and systems and laws and so on, but it's come from that side. And the point I would call this, we call this like the primacy of being. So this analogy with Neil Gilchrist, who's like the primacy of the right hemisphere. So we have 2 hemispheres. crudely, one is the analytical, the left, the language, and one is the gestalt, the whole. Now we need both hemispheres. We need technology. We need systems change. We need inner change. But the question is, has primacy at the present, given our situation, and what actually allows us to scale in the solution to collective action. So that's the kind of core thesis. And so I need to give some concrete examples from history about this. And I also want to make an important point, which is, of course, once we create technologies, they do influence our being. I mean, this is what's properly done, and this is hard to do on a podcast. The causatory path is a complex ecosystem where culture causes institutions that structure technology, and then technology structures being. So, for example, right now we have online media platforms that maybe amplify polarization and echo chambers. We have their profit oriented, which is a structure of capitalism, and so on. And those things are shaping the minds of our young people. We now know that social media, separate even from cultural polarization, is having profound impacts on the minds of those brought up on it, right? In terms of attention, in terms of maybe the way they see the world. So there is, of course, a loop. It's not a single linear, like culture causes the result. However, in this scaling in collective action, that has been crucial. And the obvious example is religions. So the classic one is Christianity, where there's this whole new level of who is part of my group. It doesn't matter that you were born a Jew or not born a Jew, or you had to no, very simple way you can become a Christian. And then you are my brother or sister. And I bet just an example of that in real life as a collective action problem. E.O. Wilson, in his book, Darwin's Cathedral, has this beautiful example. Now it's speculative because we don't have data, but he's actually saying he reckons that the attitude where Christians basically treated each other during plagues was a major reason that Christians had a higher birth rate than Romans. There were other reasons. They were pronatalist. But he actually has this example that your willingness to die for your brother or sister, there's a lot of evidence that if you're cared for during a plague, when you have a serious fever, makes a major difference in your outcome. And the payoff, if I'm willing to care for you and you for me, is higher than the risk to me of infection. So this thing that Christians would go and look after each other during plagues, like really be willing to die for each other, had a major impact in solving one collective action. So Christianity's example. We have other examples. I think the kind of weirdest one, which is to go to Henrich, is that maybe the weird package of cultural innovations in the Catholic Church in about 500 AD about marriages leads to much greater trust of strangers and leads to the nation state. So you've got to remember, just to end here, the nation state, which we now don't like so much, but is a breakthrough compared to empire. In empire, I get taxes by oppression. I basically can only extract taxes and an army by threatening to kill you or do something to you. And therefore, there's a big limit on what tax I can raise. Basically, the public good we can support. Now, I can get big as an empire in a certain way. I can have a big army and control a big area. But nation states were extraordinary because people close to voluntarily contributed at a different level because I felt I'm part of this. And so people were willing to vote taxes and participate in armies. Famously, Napoleon's levée en masse, the French before Napoleon, when the French, after the French Revolution, they're threatened by invasion by all the other places that are threatened by them. They can raid an army at a scale almost unprecedented because it's an army of citizens. And that was, again, a cultural innovation in the sense, this incredible breakthrough of the vision of equality of man. If you're my lord and I'm your peasant, why would I don't really want to go and die for you. But if you, my brother and sister in some sense, my comrade, that's different. Now, we do want to look on the scale of human history of how recent the French Revolution is. And you think of Christianity, we're 200 years from the French Revolution. Everyone says communism failed. I always joke, have you seen Silicon Valley startups? I mean, they're not communist. Of course, they have different equity levels, but the level of self-organizing groups with much higher degrees of equity, maybe in privileged areas, but often these are the leading edge of our society, is dramatic. Holacracy and teal circles and this and that. So, we'd like that cultural evolution to go faster and for it to cash out more radically in changes in our society faster than it is. But there are changes. And I kind of want to end on this hope, which is it's like watching paint dry or watching the grass grow. The problem is that cultural evolution happens over generations. But if you look back, 200 years ago or 300 years ago, most places had legal slavery. Nowhere did women have the vote. A century a bit ago, most places didn't have the vote. Now, there is backsliding. There are many challenges today, but my point is we do see sometimes dramatic changes in norms and values very quickly. And so why going back to this 4 types of problem is that technology can support. Like right now, I'm having this call with you. I can coordinate over distances because of technology. And technology does create being. But these breakthroughs in new levels of collective action happen at this kind of cultural inner layer. And then that cashes out into institutions that reinforce that technology that supports that and so on. Now, we could have a debate about the plow and like deistic religions. There's a lot of subtlety in this, but it's certainly an inversion if you're familiar with the Marxist approach of economy comes first, then culture is an effect of the economy or of this institutional structures. That's what we're inverting in the primacy of being. And it is a story of hope. Cultural evolution is possible. The third noble belief of the second Renaissance, credo. First is we're in a Pollock crisis. Second, we're in a meta crisis. There is a common root to the crisis we face. But the third is hope. Like Buddha's third noble truth is that liberation is possible. Cultural evolution is possible, and we've done it before, and it's not easy.
So we've done it before. There's a couple of axes I want to play across with you here. One is in bringing up Silicon Valley, I'm reminded of a piece by Paul Millard that he wrote on Pathless called "Are Long Games Real? I Suspect Mostly No." It's like the notion that we've done this, like you said, is conditioned by a culture of care and reciprocity and the formation of national identity, et cetera, tribal identity, going all the way back.
Yes.
And so he says about Silicon Valley, he's quoting Naval.
We're living on fumes.
Right.
We're living on, I just want to say this, we're living on fumes often. We're currently functioning. Capitalism, if it really worked on pure rational self-interest, would collapse tomorrow. It actually even works because there is a legacy of ethical trust and behavior that underpins the functioning even of the market. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry,
so I said this was the meat and potatoes of the conversation I had with Jim O'Shaughnessy, who was talking about how Wall Street doesn't operate without trust. And we were edging toward this point that, in my mind, one of the core themes of this show, I should say, is that when we're talking about multi-scale regulation and understanding what it means to meet power with wisdom in a world of magical technologies, that we have to think about, you're talking about preference and will, that preference is market activity, this bottom up, the conditions of your life. You don't choose your preferences, you discover them. And then will is that executive function. It's regulatory, but the neocortex that's making these executive decisions is actually, again, Paul Levy's point about George W. Bush, that executive orders are an emergent bottom-up effect. These are like this top-down stuff. And this, again, comes out of the time I had with SFI, thinking about papers like Jessica Flack's fabulous coarse graining as a downward causation mechanism, which is like the #1 science paper I would recommend to anyone, probably. Thinking about policing in primate societies and how alpha male rhesus macaques, the reason that they have the position at the top of a dominance hierarchy is because they are the best at mediating conflict, and that the whole troop is now being selected for as an individual evolutionary group selection. And so in healthy hierarchies, this is a stratification of the ability to mitigate the violence that would otherwise occur in all against all conflict, which is something that we talk a lot about, is all against all narrative conflict in the postmodern, where like nothing is true, there is no vertical, these kinds of things. So anyway, go back to Silicon Valley. Paul Millard's quoting Naval Ravikant. He says, if you're in a situation, like for example, if you're in Silicon Valley where people are doing business with each other and they know each other, they trust each other, then they do right by each other because they know this person will be around for the next game. And then Paul says, if you were in Silicon Valley toward the end of the 2010s, you saw evidence that this game worked. Everyone who was around for more than 10 years was successful and likely rich. But he says, I think the charitable interpretation of what's going on in Silicon Valley is not that there are people thinking long-term at all, but that an environment exists where being more generous and helping others succeed is rewarded. and that this is different than many other parts of the economy. So this gets to the question of like how much will really plays into this. Like it's obviously huge and crucial. And I wouldn't be doing this show if I didn't believe that it's easy to fund power and it's hard to fund wisdom. And that this is where I want to lean in, because the transformation of consciousness, not just flow state engineering, right? Not just stealing fire, which is obviously like your point about Wheel and Kotler is like, this is an instrumental end. You're missing the point if you are trying to use psychedelics merely to ideate. It's going to happen. But okay.
It's remote instruments and to what end? Just to say on the four types of problem, I should maybe come back to, because it relates to the wisdom point you're making. So like one, maybe you just could think of, a simple example. I'm overweight and I want to lose weight. One thing is there's some pill I can take. This is the science solution. The second one is my preferences. What is it that I actually want? I'm like, what I mean, the problem of preferences is really knowing what we want is actually hard. Do I want a chocolate cake right now? Or do I want my weight to be X in 2 years? Actually distinguishing that, or like more, what do I want in my life truly, is like in Buddhism, we consider a very deep question, or in its cognitive science. But then this question of will. I know I want to lose weight. I'm not using it, and I want to not eat that chocolate cake, but I do. So that's what I mean by problems of will, is that often we have many examples where we know what we want to do in some part of us, but we don't do it. And then the collective action problem is, but there's all this advertising around me promoting like chocolate cakes, and I need that to change to help me. Or is it in the climate crisis? It's like the preferences problem is, what do we really want? Do we want more plastic toys, or do we want the rainforest around? What do we really want? And what do we want in terms of acting on that? Why I say this is that when I grew up, I did economics, and every textbook starts with like, our preferences are given. And I once wrote a post and was doing work on a Buddhist economics book where I was like, okay, Buddha starts at a totally different point, which is that preferences are changeable. I can transform my craving. And it's like the inverse of Econ 101, which is my preferences are given. And so I wouldn't even say we discover our preferences. We transform our preferences. I mean, we do discover them. We see them deeply, but this is quite a deep point, like, which calls into question, by the way, many of the sacred cows of modernity as well, which is, if I don't really know what I want, why should I be allowed to choose what I want in a market or in a democracy? I'm not that saying that someone should decide for you. But I've got a whole piece, actually. There's a beautiful talk by Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Zen master, called Technology is Horse. And the point is, there's a point where he's in Silicon Valley at Google, and there should be this bell of mindfulness on mobile phones. And they're talking about it, the engineer. And then he says, but we've got to make that an option. You should have click it on or off. And Thich Nhat Hanh's like, no, it should be compulsory. And the tension's like, what? And Thich Nhat Hanh's like, but the tension's like, of course people should be able to choose. They got to know what they want. Thich Nhat Hanh's like, no, they don't. Of course they don't know what they want. And it was this amazing moment where, of course, it's obvious for him as a master that we don't mostly know what we want. And that is the sacred assumption of modernity, that I do know what I want and I should get to choose what I want and so on. And actually, a one-side point of wisdom is not that someone else should tell me what I want, but acknowledging how little I know what I want and how little I'm able to act on what I want. You can see that just with your thoughts. That's why meditation is great. I'm going to stop having the thoughts about X. I'm going to stop having thoughts altogether for a while. I'm just going to sit in those, try it. It doesn't work at all. And so this is a very deep point once we see it about who we are. And just to say, in terms of like paradigmatic shift, if we were all walking around with t-shirts that said, I am not my thoughts and feelings, I have them, that would be a major shift. Like just starting to realize that I am not those things. It has them. Is itself this beginning of the wisdom. And that's why I'm saying, though, a breakthrough in preferences and a breakthrough in will, and then a breakthrough in coordination for collective action is some of the crucial things for addressing the wicked problems we have, because they are an aspect of corrupted preferences. Now, it's true that then the capitalist system we're in feed those aspects, because we've created a system that rewards a short-term feedback mechanism of reward resourcing, which is based on profit and so on. And so it's very difficult to get out of it. You know, to give one last anecdote about that, this guy called Edgar Schein, who was like the pioneer of corporate culture studies. He was at MIT. I think he's passed away. But I remember he was reading his book, and there was one anecdote that really showed, I think it was General Foods, one of these huge conglomerates in the US for food. And there's a point like the late 70s, early 80s, they're like, our mission statement is like healthy food for healthy people or something like this. And they get really troubled because they see that stuff with a lot of sugar and other stuff is getting to sell more. And they're actually like a board level or really high level discussion. They're like, okay, this is not what we stand for. These are not our values. We are going to go out and really market for like healthy food and explain this. And basically it's a disaster. Like they come back, they're like, man, we can just not persuade consumers to eat this healthy stuff. It's not going well. There's this moment of like, what are they going to do? Are they going to stay with being profitable in a way and existing as a company? Or are they going to pursue their vision, their mission? And they change their mission statement. And the thing is, the thing that I joke is that the thing that's going on at the moment also is that we are their mission and they change their mission state. It's like whirlpool, it's like first and scale and all these things. You're stuck in this whirlpool, and the way out of that is never going to be like minor things. It's going to be a major shift in both the system and the inner dimension. And I do want to emphasize that the two go together. It's like we need the right and the left hemisphere. We need systems change and we need inner change. But often we're trying to do systems change without inner change. And it's like we're trying to do AI governance and be like, oh shit, why have we got this race to bottom problem? Oh, everyone should rationally, all those rationalists in the air, but don't we see that we should do something about this? Yeah, welcome to collective action problems 101. The culture is how we've done that. If I think there's a God watching me, or I think that I'm actually interdependent with you, Michael, if I actually got into being, wow, I'm act differently. If I really see my interconnection with others in a profound way, and that's going to make a real difference. Just as the fact that we have evidence that believing in a God who's watching my inner conscience all the time has significant impacts on behavior.
Exactly. And this is why I think it's funny, because it feels like a collective action problem. I think for a similar reason that it feels like the hard problem of consciousness, because it's a category error, right? It's if like you're saying, it's if we're trying to get a bunch of individuals to agree, then it's a problem. If you
Yes.
and I feel that deep sense of solidarity, like if we find a deep commonality of identity, however fluid and contingent and relational that
Yes.
identity might be, then it's not a collective action problem, because the quote unquote collective action of apparent selves will emerge naturally. And so this is where I'm getting tired. I said this in the Second Renaissance Discord server and had an interesting conversation with some people about it. Like, I'm getting tired of attending to the idea of the meta crisis, because it seems like it's starting to have the same kind of effect that people trying to solve the hard problem are having. If you just don't regard mind and body as separate, it goes away. And so rather than like first person, third person, interiority, objectivity kind
Mm.
of axis, I want to talk about this in terms of your point about faith and the way that I have constituted something like faith, which as you make very clear, is not a negation of responsibility. Like, commitment is crucial in religion in all forms. But there is this thing about slowing down. And I just want to say, I love this passage in the piece that you wrote. Let's see, this one was called, you mentioned it earlier, Technology as God, the one you wrote with Sylvie, where you say, slowing down is not about rejecting progress. Instead, it is about making time for reflection. There are moments in life where speed is necessary, but wisdom is about recognizing when it is time to slow down. A wiser approach to technology involves deep inquiry into the source of our actions. When we create new technologies, we must ask, where is this coming from? Is it motivated by wisdom and compassion, or is it driven by fear, greed, or ignorance? And then the two of you give this wonderful, it's so funny because the tech company I quit, actually, like, the founder knew Sam Altman from back in the day. I think they had gone through Y Combinator together and hated him and was trying to come up with a different vision for AI. And so this next piece, imagine if instead of rushing into product development, the first weeks at an incubator like Y Combinator were spent in deep reflection. What if creators were asked to meditate on their intentions, to explore whether their innovations were coming from a place of love and compassion or from a place of ego and competition? Okay, hold that thought. And then, like, most people listening to this are probably rushing in to this question of, like, how do we design a an incubator for wise technologists? I have these conversations with my friends all the time, and like, part of me is just, okay, you don't. Maybe
Yes.
okay, so to go back to being at SFI and being a cerebral scientific monastery exile, then there's this thing that really stuck with me about their work, which was that the larger an anthill gets, the fewer ants are working at any time because the transport networks inside of an ant colony do not scale at the same rate as the number of ants. Like the population density goes up. And so you literally cannot maintain the same level of productivity per individual in an anthill twice as big without some of them just slowing down. And that's not like the question of whether that is a decision on the part of the ants is a little bit easier to see as a non-starter when you realize that ant communication is moderated through pheromone trails, and it looks to us with human eyes like that down there in ant world, they're basically just following these prompts. And it's like harder to see how the ways that our own behavior is constrained has to do with the downward causal pressure of our media diets and of the egregores that we allow to possess us and all of this stuff. Or like capillaries, blood flows slower through your fingertips than it does through your neck because as the tube gets smaller and smaller, the very distal ends of your circulatory system are non-pulsatile flow. It's not going through in these big spurts. And that's a property of the scaling of the network itself. And so like Brian Arthur made this point that we need, and Hazel Henderson wrote about the importance of redistributing economic wealth production through the taxation on high frequency automated microtransactions. And I'll link to a cool piece Bill Thompson wrote about Brian Arthur's piece on this in McKinsey in 2011 and how basically, if you think about the increasing scale of the global economy, its increasing need to be automated again as the channel that regulates all of this, coordinates all of this planet scale activity, then at some point it does need little hearts pumping in it everywhere. And designing that is at a scale beyond our comprehension. And we can come up with ideas, but then we immediately get into this collective action problem of how do we get people to accept our ideas? Or how do we push the ideas out into this massive communications network? And for me, again, and I don't want to sound like an apologist for accelerationism here,
Yes.
but when Bill Thompson says evil is the enunciation of the next level of order, and when he's talking about the karmic dynamics of affirmation through negation and how so much of this is unconscious to us, then this is where sitting here watching the global economy spin out of control and all of this crazy shit go down, I feel like I am being naturally called to faith. Like, again, like this thing about meditation is not something you do, right? Like you prepare the conditions for awakening. You can go stand on a hill and try to get hit by lightning. And so again, we're chasing each other around these causal loops here. But I think probably a lot of people who are concerned about this stuff and care about social transformation and the need to promote wisdom in the world are starting from a set of assumptions that makes it our responsibility somehow, where it's actually happening at multiple different scales. You are part of this thing. Making that more visible to us is like part of the shift of perspective that allows us to relax around this in the way that Josh DiCalio was talking about. Well, like this question of what can you do seems to always come back to what are you doing about it, you, the individual, when that's not the nature of the problem. And to even call it a problem is to belie a preference, maybe, for seeing good and evil as somehow like distinct from each other. The last thing I'll say about this, because you brought up not discovering our preferences and Thich Nhat Hanh, and it just reminded me of this story. So this is like me making a kind of conciliatory gesture after all of that One of the most important experiences I had in college was in chemistry 2, and I hated that class, and I hated that teacher. It was a huge 900-person lecture hall. The guy leading the course thought he was hilarious, and he was utterly boring and could not make the material interesting to save his life, and you'd look around, and half the people in the class were doing the crossword. Now it would be everybody's on their phone. But, like, one day, I looked at the front row of the class, and there was a student there at a time when laptops in class were still relatively rare. He was sitting there, like, perched on the edge of his seat, just hanging on every word that this guy had to say. And I was like, if he can do it, I can do it. There's something interesting here. I may not see it. Like, and this is again that sort of non-duality of the discovery or creation of preference. That was the moment that my neocortical functions came online, and I was like, if it turns out that what is interesting is purely a matter of perspective, then I can operationalize my attention to make anything interesting. If this guy can find Chem 2 interesting, then I can find Chem 2 interesting. And if I can find Chem 2 interesting, literally anything will disclose wonders if you attend to it in the right way. And so whether you want to talk about preference as created or like created implies will in some sense. It implies for Thich Nhat Hanh.
It's such,
Yeah.
it's such, it's a cultivation. There's a subtlety, right? Like about it. It's neither like I can engineer it, but I can cultivate a garden. I can invite certain things in and disinvite other things. Like in Buddhism, they talk about these seeds. You have unwholesome seeds and wholesome seeds. Like unwholesome would be anger or greed, and a wholesome seed would be love or compassion. And these things manifest a bit of their own will in your mind. But somehow, and this is a much more subtle question now about what is doing the doing here, who's having, but we could get into that. But the thing is, there's some way you can invite the unwholesome seeds to return to the storehouse and the wholesome seeds to manifest. I just want to come back to say, just in terms of the arc we're going. So one is like, for me, even personally, but maybe for listeners, say, whether at a personal level, you're like, okay, how can I have a really joyful, flourishing life? Why am I not super happy, satisfied, and at peace? But also more at a collective level, I imagine, whether you're worried about existential risk from AI, or the possibilities even of using AI in a world where even without us all dying, how will it be used in the climate situation and the ecological situation? The thesis was like, oh, these are real challenges and there are paths forward. And they require, of course, change in these multiple dimensions, and understanding those dimensions of at least technology, systems, and the inner, and distinguishing maybe the personal inner and the cultural is really valuable, like the integral quadrants. And the thesis of that we need a focus, which is not the case in the world today, on the inner. Now, I'd wager a bet right now that if we went and counted all the philanthropic spending in the US right now on making the world better, or in the world today, a fraction of maybe even 1% is on the kind of inner dimension, if we also exclude the retreat centers. But that's a priority. Now, the next question would be, Rufus and Michael, how does that occur? And in the background, the thing, two things is religion and spirituality. Like these psychotechnologies that we have invented in human history, and are those. And I even want to say that like modernity and science, at least in the form of scientism, is kind of a religion. It's a worldview you don't really question. It has obvious limitations, mind, body problem, anyone, and other ones, but it's taken as a kind of faith, and things that outside its remit don't exist and aren't allowed to be talked about. But the thing I'm just trying to say is we're interested in religion and spirituality in the sense, now religion is something of a dirty word. So we have to recover religion from the taint of the Inquisition and dogmatism and all the things, at least in the West, that it's associated sometimes with. But the fact is, that is the psychotechnology, and it's key to our personal flourishing and this collective aspect of things. And it's related even to your question of how we, the going slower and the multiple other aspects. But essentially, this point of, okay, what are the religions of tomorrow? And I want to make one comment here also, because it relates to slowing down what happens in your capillary analogy, all these things. I actually brought this up with Jim Rutt, because what happened at the end of the Roman Empire? Let's go for a look at when paradigms or systems ended. And we had the rise of Christianity. Christianity, we have all the evidence. So we certainly know in the Dark Ages, there was less economic activity. There was social economic trade networks got simpler. But the thing about Christianity was it wasn't about power and empire, right? It was a return to the sacred. It was a return to the inner dimension. Now, I'm not saying we want that, but I think we're in a moment where the nearest analogy of modernity is to something like the Roman Empire. It's incredibly expansive, growth-oriented, imperial in a way. And we're at a moment when, I mean, this analogy, this return to the sacred, there was a kind of calming down. Now, there are many things we could critique about Christianity, but it offered something that the other system couldn't. And this is the thing also, it's actually in E.O. Wilson's book again, actually, Darwin's Cathedral. I can't remember the name of the Roman he describes, but it's a true story. We know it from the story of martyrs, actually, afterwards. But he's a young, rich Roman. You can imagine today, young rich man's day, a woman, and he's going to the circus for entertainment. He's bored. He's got everything he could have in life in ancient Rome. And he goes to the circus one day and he sees Christians being torn apart by lions. And he has this epiphany because he watches them and they are calm. They are at peace as the lions come for them. And he realizes that they have something that he will never have out of his life. They are touching something that all of the nice dinners, all of the visits to the Circus Maximus won't bring. And it is the sacred of a kind. We could have our opinions on Christianity, but there was something, I think, probably in most great religions where they touch something very real at the heart of them. And that's what he saw in some of those people's eyes. Now, we could see them as self-deceiving or something. But I think probably for people, there is something that we can touch that is beyond ourselves. And I would say is immanent, but is also practical and is not just, but that can be integrated. I mean, I'd say here again, I want to shout out the great thinkers of the Second Renaissance for me. McGilchrist is one who does this incredible job of speaking from the world of reason, but talking about what transcends it or what complements it. That particularly the matter with things, what he even reconstructs the whole theory of truth, pragmatism, and so on. But really, he has the values that he has it all there. And actually, Christopher Alexander, who again has all of this reason, all of this explanation concretely of how to build buildings. What is special about this wall behind me? Why is it beautiful to us and hold to us in a way that this ceiling up there, which is just plasterboard, is not? And he has reason. He has a whole bunch of analysis, very deep. He was a mathematician originally at Cambridge. And in his final volume of The Nature World, he says, but I've also got to come clean, that there's something transcendent that is beyond words that you touch and that you can feel when you feel wholeness. And so one of the things I'm saying here is, I don't see the solution, but one of the paths forward through the meta crisis, but it's also a catalyst, the meta crisis for us, is to recover, I don't mean go back, but rediscover and renew the sacred and the religious in our life in a way that is not oppressive and dogmatic. And that, there's a piece which you referenced at the beginning about what are these qualities, these kind of high level qualities of religions of the future we might look to. And we've seen some of them even in things like Quakerism, maybe. And there are ways that this intersects with technology. And I think this is the point where I want to talk a bit about AI, of how sad it is that we want to make a god of this. Not that we want to make gods of ourselves, but it's in a funny way, it's like what we're doing in Christianity when we other it into God. Rather, I was reading about Quakerism just last night because Quakers are very interested in it. The big thing for them was the second coming was not external. It was internal. In Quakerism, I am entering the kingdom of heaven right now. And this aspect that we want to abdicate to some technological God outside of ourselves, our own responsibility and opportunity to be part of, not to be the dominant, because we are part of this incredible unfolding. That is the world, that is the living. But to abdicate this, or in the other pessimistic sense, to see us as so corrupt in this question, classic Christian mythos, that also the effective acceleration is some part of them seem to be in. If we're so corrupt and hopeless that we only can hope to be taken over by our AI overlords. No, both of those are roads to ruin. And we need to take on our responsibility of wisdom and our responsibility to forge new visions. And to go back, as the Roman Empire fell, that's when the Christianity rose. And this moment, as modernity falls, some things, plural, I think, are going to renew. And we see that.
Definitely. I just want to say that, again, as you make clear in this piece, Getting Over Our Allergy to Religion, you say that the psychotechnologies are often less directly relevant for the religio aspect and may not be used that much by the majority of participants. However, perhaps could make a strong case that these are important to key participants, e.g., leaders, where these can ensure higher quality leadership. Now, without,
That's actually just say, but
yeah,
that I mean, like meditation. You might have people in Christianity or Buddhism who are deeply contemplating. That's not that everyone is doing so. That said, I should think that spreads through your population. You'd have something very different, and you have a society maybe infused with those practices would look very different. But I was just trying to say, I'm not claiming that everyone is attaining arhatship in a Buddhist society. But yeah,
yeah, exactly. And it's funny because I think something that's implied, I think in a way I might be misleading people by suggesting with the question, how does wisdom keep pace with power? That it does. And that, or rather, that like when we're talking about power, again, we're talking about something that, first of all, can be produced relatively rapidly and wisdom takes time. But we're also talking about, I think there's a conflation of scale here. Like
yeah,
that the idea that Josh DiCalio put forward, I argued this in a one-to-one with Jamie Curcio, who's been on the show, because Josh DiCalio said one can only act on the scale at which one exists. And Jamie said, there's a lot to that idea. However, we just saw a complete idiot get up on a podium and tank the world economy with a single announcement. The question to me is that paradox of power implied in that, to which I replied, it's still fairly obvious that none of us can be entirely sure what the consequences of his intervention will actually be. And he sent me a link from Game of Thrones where Varys tells Tyrion Lannister a riddle about power and says, power resides where people believe it resides, and a very small man can cast a very large shadow. To which I quoted V for Vendetta, ideas are bulletproof. The power is in the egregoric shadow of the collective agency of society projected onto our leaders. It's like money. It's like the whole thing about people are always saying Bitcoin made it obvious to substantially more people that value is legible values. Again, it's people's concordant on
beliefs.
a manifold of attention.
Sure, a
Yeah,
coordination.
it makes
It's just hard to do. Bitcoin is rare. It's very hard to invent things where people reach coordination on something like that. But that is ways we solve new kinds of problems. And it to go to the question of that, is there, yeah, in this question of power and wisdom, I wanted to emphasize in the Roman Empire case is when something comes too big, the system rotted out to some extent from within. We see that now. Capitalism, in a sense, has become quite corrupt, not in the direct sense that people are paid money, but there's a sort of corruption in a very deep sense that, for example, does anyone think that the people generating the most value in this world are getting paid the most money? No. Even the most obvious thing, and we're getting a bit technical, and I've got this would go off to the Open Revolution, but the arrival of the information economy was the end of markets in a very fundamental sense. Markets work because price and value have some relationship. I mean, that's what markets are supposed to do and send a signal. But in an information economy, because of all the violations, I have infinite supply once I've got the first copy, roughly. Like I have unlimited supply because I have non-convex production functions in technical economic jargon. Because I don't have price taking, I have monopolies if I have copyright and so on. All of the things that underpin a market working and the first law, the first fundamental welfare theorem in economics go away. And in fact, we see like lots of goods that have zero price. They're open source software. We are in a time between worlds. Like in that sense, like value and price have separated. There is a great corruption afoot in our world because you can see the things that are highly valuable in a true sense of value, but are not very much related to price anymore. And there's a deep corruption in our system. Now, there's two ways when a wisdom gap gets too big. Wisdom can get a lot bigger, or power, I would prefer to call it force, can get smaller. Now, as I said, in previous times, the most egregious analogy I could think of is the end of the Roman Empire, when force toppled over and you had this collapse back into a kind of wisdom-oriented tradition and a much smaller system for a period. Now, at the moment, I don't know. The way it's going, we have to be honest that we don't see wisdom catching up fast enough to force. And we see systems which are teetering on the edge of major breakdown. And the biggest hope I have at the moment is the climate crisis will get worse enough fast enough, but not too bad, that it will significantly retard technological progress to a point when we can be more rational, even a deep sense, and wise about it. That's not a given. But I'm just trying to say that it's a weird world where what one's hoping for is external slowdown. But that's what has happened in past systems when they grow past their point. Again, it happens the Catholic Church topples over out of corruption at the end of its age. It becomes selling indulgences and all of these things. And that's what we're doing at the moment. And I feel that one of the things that's also powerful, and you mentioned at the very beginning, before we really started recording, but it was about sense making, like I'm making notes and things. One of the things that is powerful is when we get an understanding. Now, no worldview is correct, but when we have certain gestalt shifts that makes the sense of what's going on. So, for example, for me, at least, once we have this understanding of the unfolding crisis and the idea of paradigms, we're in a moment of massive cultural tension between core paradigms.
Mm-hmm.
And the analogy, again, is like just history, it does rhyme. Like, who knows their counter-Reformation history? Now, I'm here in France. There were wars of religion for 30 years over Protestantism. I'm living in a farmhouse where there was a Protestant chapel that became a pigeonnier for pigeons. Why? Because the Protestants were expelled after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. And right now we're in a world of like counter-Reformationists, what I would call counter-postmodernist or whatever comes after it. They're against what could be coming. And so these things then make a lot of sense what's going on. So we can fixate on the travel. But what I also want to leave with is as we take on these kind of tools of sense making, these worldviews and play with them, they do allow us to have a huge contextual understanding, I feel, where you can at least go, oh, that's what's going on. And you can see the plate tectonics, the metaphor of like, it makes no sense where all the volcanoes are happening. And once you see plates under the ocean rubbing against each other, we can see where a lot of the friction is going to happen. So right now we have this alliance of pre-modernists, people who never even got into modernity, for example, in the US, and modernists against basically postmodernists and others. And so we have a huge 2 or 3 way culture war, which is therefore why you get in those moments, you get a lot of counter-Reformationists. You get Jordan Peterson going off the deep end because he's triggered about pronouns. And this is equivalent to Marxist takeover of thought. And also grokking the culture war that the postmodernists have been waging very cleverly for 40, 50 years. They gave up on the systems. They realized if they took the culture first, then they would get the systems later. So we are in a rocky time in that regard. But I'm just saying that it then allows us to act kind of ourselves skillfully through it. The biggest issue that we have is, I still think, is that there are the madmen and women running around saying, let's go even faster. The train is out of control. The thing to do is pile more coal into the boiler and race towards, we'll jump the precipice. There's no way to slow down. And the biggest thing I want to say to that, just to end on this thing, is that is creating a story that's not true. If we all decide tomorrow we wanted to pause AI research, we could. There's not a question. People constantly conflate the how with the preferences. And it's very important. We know we could do all kinds of things together. We saw COVID. We shut down whole economies for weeks on end. We can do incredible things as humanity and as part of the biosphere, but we have to choose to do so. And part of that is realizing that we are powerful individually and together in ways that we haven't seen yet.
To go all the way back to the beginning of Bill Thompson's career, he wrote Imagination of an Insurrection about the Irish Revolution in 1916 and makes the case that W.B. Yeats did more than any single soldier on the front lines of that conflict. Yeats was criticized for not joining the fight. And it's like, well, Yeats created the mythic imagination of the Irish people. And without that shared cultural framework or field, there would have been no revolution. But then the other thing you and I have been circling around is the fact that, as Thompson kind of hammers on again and again in his writing on planetization, that, let's see, he closes Imaginary Landscape with the following. He says, in culture, the ego is diffuse. In society, the ego became articulated and defined in the mystery school of death. In civilization, the ego became discrete, a literally defined center with a sharply defined periphery. In industrialization, the ego became a turbulent flow, a chaotic attractor with the power of a Cosimo de' Medici, a Descartes, a Beethoven, and a Napoleon to break through boundaries and definitions to amass the glory and power and wealth that it felt was its proper destiny. Now, in planetization, the ego is no longer diffuse, certainly no longer articulate, unable any longer to be discrete in the privacy of its civilized study, and no longer able to expect the biosphere to sustain the amassing of its glory and wealth. The diachronic flow of the ego has come to its end, and now the synchronic dimensions of the spiritual daimon is beginning to enfold itself into temporal consciousness.
Yes.
Multidimensionality begins to be experienced as the personal field of consciousness, the interrelatedness of all sentient beings in the innumerable universes that are suspended from the tip of Buddha's hair. Lacking the appropriate and futuristic image to imagine this so very much like a cultural historian, I fall back on the past and envision the Sephiroth, the tree of life from the Judaic Kabbalah, but I see this flat rendering on a two-dimensional page transformed into a multidimensional crystal in which the lattice is recursive and the ego is the foundation, but all of the other nodes are part of the architecture of an individual but enlightened consciousness. So the point about Yeats is at the time, it seemed like Yeats was this dynamic, romantic genius. And like, this is like a social media influencer, right? But that paradigm that is what you are saying is like what Thompson calls the sunset effect, the inflammation of a cultural order as it is transformed. And he
Yeah.
used to talk about the alt-right movement as the ghost dance of the rednecks. We're watching the same kind of thing. And what I see with this idea that we are building an AI god, what I see with
Yes.
the anxiety around the maintenance of the scientific institution as somehow separate,
Yes.
all of this stuff it's like the first hour of an acid trip where you're like, oh
Yes.
no, what have I done? I'm falling apart. The funny thing though is that in that tension between the people who are hitting the gas and the people who are hitting the brakes, you're generating a lot of friction. You're generating a lot of heat, like you're talking about. And to a physicist, heat does work. So the question I have, I'll leave it to you to close
Yes.
this, but like the question that I think Bill's asking and Campagna's asking and you and I are asking and all these other people is that friction looks like noise to us. But to the theoretical physicists I used to work with, there's a mathematical proof that optimally encoded information is indistinguishable from noise. We get
Yes.
back to faith. It's like, okay, this seems like really violent and chaotic and senseless. But is that just because we have not learned how to make sense of what we think is noise?
Yeah. Have we just not worked out how to make sense of the noise? Well, I think there's two parts. First, I just want to acknowledge Thompson as this just incredible jazz player of the second renaissance of the new age and someone who is too early a little bit. And I think I want to come back to that about patterning. So one thing that we can make confusion is like in plate tectonics. Once we have plate tectonics, we can see where volcanoes and earthquakes will happen, but we don't know when. So it's hard to call the timings of things, but we are like the patterner in Ursula Le Guin. We can see patterns at the moment using our historical analogy. And one of them that is there are these cultural paradigms that are clashing and something new is going to be born. There is an exhaustion. Like the ecological boundary is the death knell of endless progress in capitalism. And that confronts capitalism with its kind of end, or even modernity, because in communism too, a kind of material growth. So we can see patterns that tell us things right now and that heat. The other aspect, though, is we don't know the future, but we can feel parts of it. So one of it is the return of religio. The one of it is the return of the binding, a return of a way to perceive value in non-oppressive, but like collective ways and pursue it in communion with others and the collective. And for that to animate new forms of governance and society, we can feel those things and we don't know in the light and the heat, but we are in a time between worlds. We are in the period of death and rebirth, and it's going to potentially be very painful, which is why we need each other. And the last thing I say is like why life itself do we have these hubs? The big thing is like there's the big vision, there's second renaissance, there's all of this stuff. But then there's the day-to-day of like, well, how do we actually live together? How do we actually experiment with and pioneer new ways of being and doing together? How do we actually grow food and eat it? How do we actually create resources and generate energy and create new ways of organizing? That's also really crucial that we go and experiment. And I think those are things we can bet on in the patterning. That in this heat, we can use it to channel our energies into this kind of experimentation and creation of new forms of consciousness. I might even say it's a bit grandiose, but that is what we're trying to do, right? We have to find ways beyond our greed and our suffering to find that abundance and trust and compassion that allows us to knit something truly not just new, but transformative. Because to finish it, we do love. There is something to say it's not neutral. We care about the biosphere. We care about each other. It is better to, not that it's wrong to have a broken rose. A rose will always decay one day and become again. It's not that we must preserve something as is, but we care about life on earth. We care about the living. We care about the potential complexity that we carry with us and our potential for the future of the biosphere and the human race and all beings. And that's something we want to tend with care and wisdom.
Amen. It's good riffing with you.
I got to bring the baby. I'm in trouble for things. It was amazing, Michael. Really lovely. And I feel we should do another one. I interview you more,
Sure.
but that was great. I look forward to, I hope, did you enjoy it?
Oh yeah, of course. I'm just sitting here thinking the computer slows down if it gets hot enough. Maybe
that will happen. Exactly.
Maybe we'll all just live in our cozy adobes and
gone.
garden if things get too spicy around here. This has been fun, man. I look forward to riffing with you more. And yeah, do send Sylvie my way when it makes sense.
Oh, I want to do that. That would be, and talk about art, which we didn't do at all today, and ritual. That was the thing I didn't actually get to say, but it was like, what are the roles of religion in the broader religious sense? How do we create the ceremonies, the rituals, which we have lost for many years?
Yeah, with Sylvie, I'll switch and I'll let her technologize art and ritual and I'll poeticize it somehow.
That would be great. I will send it your way.
All right.
Lots of love, Michael. And one day I hope to see you. I don't know if there's a way to get you ever come to Europe. I will come to the US, but lots and lots of love.
Likewise, man. Take care. Thanks again for listening. If you liked this episode, dig into the archives and learn more about the perks of membership at humansontheloop.com. And find your people by joining us in the Wisdom and Technology Discord server linked in the show notes. I'm stepping back for a few weeks to finish my book, but I have a few new Substack articles on the way on the future of human work, the evolution of knowledge tools, and the politics of space exploration. Hang tight, and regular episodes will resume in the first week of August. Until then, take care, and remember, attention is our greatest natural resource. Or is it imagination?